A prison sentence that shocked the nation. A political leader who stayed silent too long. And now a fiery clash that has set Westminster ablaze. Keir Starmer has finally broken his silence on the Lucy Connelly scandal. But not with calm restraint. His reaction, fierce, defiant, and louder than anyone expected. And in a flash, Richard Tice hit back just as hard. What was once a simmering controversy has exploded into a full-scale political war. One that could redefine justice, freedom, and leadership in Britain. This isn't just about one woman's tweet. This is about the future of democracy. And the storm is only just beginning. Lucy Connelly's story has gripped the country. From the moment she pressed send on a tweet, now deleted, now regretted, her life has unraveled in ways no one could have predicted. But it's what happened next that sent shockwaves through every home, every office, and every corner of British politics. Arrested for hate speech, sentenced to over 2.5 years in prison, not suspended, not symbolic, real time behind bars. The reaction, outrage from some, silence from others. And while the public debated, one man, Reform UK leader Richard Tice, seized the moment, calling it a clear case of political punishment. He described Lucy as a symbol of a broken system, warning that Britain had crossed a dangerous line where opinion is treated like a crime. But Keir Starmer, the man many expected to weigh in, held back. For weeks, he said little, his only comment a vague assurance that he was monitoring the situation. To many, it felt like avoidance. To others, it was strategy. But now that silence has shattered. Starmer has finally spoken, and the tone has changed. Gone is the cautious language. Gone is the diplomatic distance. Instead, Starmer has responded with sharp words, clear resolve, and an unmistakable warning. According to sources close to the Labour leadership, he was incensed by the pressure campaign launched by Tice and Reform UK. In a private meeting leaked to the press, Starmer reportedly described the Connelly backlash as politically manufactured hysteria, accusing Reform of weaponizing justice for cheap votes. And that was just the beginning. Standing before reporters this week, Starmer delivered what many are calling his most forceful statement yet on the matter. We must not confuse freedom of speech with freedom from accountability, he said, his voice steady but unmistakably stern. No one is imprisoned for their opinions. They are imprisoned when those opinions cross the line into harm, into incitement, into hate. With that, he made it clear there would be no apology, no review, no special treatment. Lucy Connelly's sentence in Starmer's eyes was the result of due process, not political persecution. But his words didn't land quietly. Within hours, Richard Tice responded, not with subtlety, not with restraint, but with fire. Taking to social media and the airwaves, Tice accused Starmer of cowardice and outright deception. This is not about justice, Tice thundered. This is about fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of an honest voice exposing the rot in the system. He claimed Starmer's statement was cold, calculated, and designed to intimidate dissent. In Tice's view, Lucy's case had become a mirror, reflecting everything wrong with the establishment. Selective outrage, double standards, and the terrifying speed at which the state now moves against its own citizens. And as the war of words escalated, so did the stakes. Tice didn't stop at criticism. He launched an emergency petition under the banner of Lucy's bill, demanding a full parliamentary inquiry into the handling of Connelly's arrest, her sentencing and her treatment inside prison. Within hours, the petition had gathered tens of thousands of signatures. Protesters rallied outside government buildings. Journalists began digging into prison records. And across the country, ordinary people, many of whom had never heard of Lucy Connelly before, started asking themselves, could this happen to me? The pressure on Starmer only intensified. Backbench MPs began whispering doubts. Legal experts appeared on television questioning the proportionality of Lucy's sentence. Even Labour supporters began to wonder whether their leader's fierce defense of the status quo was really the right response. But Starmer doubled down. In his most recent appearance at Prime Minister's Questions, he dismissed Tice's claims as political theatre and insisted that Britain must remain firm in its stand against hate speech. He drew a line, bold and unshakable, between legitimate speech and what he called socially corrosive rhetoric. But it was the way he said it, the tone, the force, the lack of empathy that set alarm bells ringing. Critics pointed out that Starmer never once mentioned Lucy Connelly's name in his statement. He referred to the case as if it were a file on a desk, not a woman in a prison cell, reportedly bruised, isolated, and denied contact with her family. He did not acknowledge the reports of mistreatment. He did not speak to the broader concerns over the severity of the sentence. He only repeated the mantra, hate must be punished. And that's when Richard Tice delivered his most explosive accusation yet. Standing outside Parliament, surrounded by reporters and furious supporters, he declared that Starmer was complicit in political torture. The words sent a jolt through the media. You don't get to pretend you support justice while ignoring injustice, Tice said. You don't get to wave the rule of law like a shield while people are being broken behind bars for words. He accused the Labour leader of hiding behind legal jargon to avoid moral responsibility. And as the cameras flashed, Tice warned, if they can do this to Lucy, they can do it to you. As tensions inside Parliament reached a fever pitch, the Connelly case continued to unravel far beyond the confines of the courtroom and political chambers. What had begun as a controversy over a tweet had now spiraled into a nationwide reckoning over justice, power, and the weaponization of speech. Keir Starmer's fierce reaction meant to assert strength and principle instead ignited a powder keg of public mistrust. The harder he pushed his line on accountability and hate speech, the louder the voices of dissent grew, painting an increasingly grim picture of a Britain that had abandoned fairness for fear and compassion for control. Inside the Labour Party itself, the atmosphere grew tense and uncertain. Whispers of unease echoed through the corridors of Westminster as a growing number of Labour MPs began expressing concerns behind closed doors. Some feared the optics of backing what many were beginning to call a political prosecution. Others privately admitted that Starmer's refusal to acknowledge the troubling reports about Lucy's prison treatment, solitary confinement, alleged manhandling, sudden transfers was fueling the opposition's narrative. But few dared speak out publicly, fearing backlash from party leadership or the press. For now, they waited, hoping the storm would pass, yet quietly bracing for impact. Meanwhile, Richard Tice was wasting no time. His media campaign intensified, drawing more eyes and ears with each fiery interview. He appeared on GB News, Talk TV, and dozens of independent platforms, hammering home the message that Lucy Connelly had become Britain's first true political prisoner in modern times. He invoked comparisons that shocked many, drawing parallels with authoritarian regimes, warning that Britain was inching toward a future where dissent is punished not by debate, but by imprisonment. If this can happen to Lucy, he repeated, it can happen to any of us. To some, it was hyperbole, but to others it sounded uncomfortably plausible. Outside Parliament, public sentiment began to shift in ways that stunned the political establishment. At first, many dismissed Lucy's case as a fringe issue, another online firestorm that would burn out within a news cycle or two. But instead, the outrage grew, not necessarily in defense of her tweet, which even her supporters admitted was offensive and ill-judged, but in reaction to the scale and brutality of the punishment. The phrase two-tier justice began trending across social media. Memes compared Lucy's sentence to those of convicted rapists and violent offenders who had received less time behind bars. Hashtags like #FreeLucy and #Justice, not vengeance, flooded platforms, turning what had been a quiet court case into a national cause. In community halls and radio call-ins, a familiar unease began resurfacing, one that had been simmering beneath the surface of British politics for years. People spoke of feeling voiceless, of fearing that speaking out, even in anger or grief, might cost them their livelihood, their reputation, or even their freedom. Journalists began interviewing citizens who had faced police visits for online comments, many of whom echoed a growing sense of paranoia. "We used to laugh at thought police," one caller said on live radio. "Now we live with them." And the media began to take note. Major outlets, initially hesitant to cover the Connelly case in depth, began publishing features on the implications of her sentencing. Columnists questioned whether the courts were beginning to punish thought crimes. Legal experts appeared on television to debate the broad scope of hate speech laws and the vagueness of what constitutes harmful content. Civil liberties groups, at first silent, issued carefully worded statements calling for a review of sentencing guidelines and prison conditions. The narrative was shifting from a question of legality to one of morality, from crime and punishment to freedom and fear. Then came the leaks. First, an anonymous prison staff member contacted a journalist with internal documents, logs showing that Lucy had been moved between 3 facilities in less than 2 weeks, each time without prior notice or legal explanation. Then came a photo leak, blurry but unmistakable, of bruising on Lucy's wrists and arms, allegedly sustained during what officials described as a standard compliance procedure. While the prison service refused to comment, public fury ignited once more. Protesters gathered outside prison gates. A formal parliamentary inquiry into prison conditions was proposed, and still Keir Starmer held his line, calm, composed, and entirely unmoved. But his resolve, once perceived as strength, now began to resemble detachment. Where Richard Tice was visible, vocal, and emotionally connected to the story, Starmer seemed insulated, robotic, even indifferent. His media appearances became increasingly strained, with reporters pressing him on whether he had personally reviewed Lucy's case. He continued to defer to judicial independence, but the moral questions kept coming. What about the bruises? What about the denial of compassionate leave? What about the woman behind the tweet? His answers, when they came, were sterile. We must respect the process. We must trust our institutions, but trust, as it turned out, was evaporating. In a flash poll conducted just days after his public remarks, only 18% of respondents said they believed Starmer had handled the Connelly case well. Over 60% said they believed the sentence was too harsh, and nearly half expressed concern that the government's approach to hate speech was moving toward overreach. The warning signs for Labour were blinking red. Richard Tice seized on the numbers. In a barn-storming speech delivered in Birmingham to a packed hall of over 2,000 supporters, he declared that the Connelly case was proof that Britain is no longer a free country. He called for mass reform not just of hate speech laws, but of the entire criminal justice system. He proposed new citizen oversight boards, a cap on prison time for non-violent speech offences, and automatic reviews for sentences that fail the common sense test. The crowd erupted in applause. For many, this wasn't just about Lucy anymore. It was about what kind of country Britain was becoming. Even within other parties, voices began to stir. A few Liberal Democrat MPs quietly signalled support for an inquiry into Lucy's prison conditions. A Green Party spokesperson said the government must urgently clarify how it distinguishes between hate and harmful outrage. And behind the scenes, even some Conservative MPs began hinting that the case had been mishandled. But still, Labour held firm, officially unmoved, publicly defiant. And then came the tipping point. A whistleblower from the Ministry of Justice provided documents to a national newspaper suggesting that Lucy's transfer to a high-security facility had been approved not on risk assessment, but on anticipated media fallout. The internal memo warned that continued public outcry could delegitimize judicial credibility if the prisoner is seen as receiving preferential treatment. In short, her harsh conditions may have been orchestrated to protect the system, not to serve justice. The revelation landed like a bombshell. Starmer was asked to comment. He declined, but the damage was done. Now even those who had once supported her sentencing were starting to question everything. Lucy's story, once contained to social media threads and protest placards, had spilled into every corner of British public life. And Keir Starmer, once the principal defender of the courts, now stood accused, if not of injustice, then of indifference. This was no longer a matter of one case. It was a referendum on leadership. And in that referendum, the people were beginning to vote, not at the ballot box, but with their voices, their outrage, and their growing willingness to stand against silence. With the Connelly crisis now dominating headlines, national broadcasts, and political agendas, the situation evolved from a controversy to a confrontation that Britain could no longer ignore. The once isolated incident of a single tweet had now metastasized into a full-blown constitutional and moral dilemma, raising uncomfortable questions about how justice is administered, who wields power in modern Britain, and whether political leaders are truly prepared to defend the principles they claim to uphold. And standing at the very center of this firestorm were two men. Keir Starmer, whose silence and sterile responses were fast becoming liabilities, and Richard Tice, whose defiance and populist clarity were galvanizing a disillusioned public desperate for answers. By now, Lucy Connie's name was etched into the national consciousness. Her face was on placards, her story shared by influencers and activists, and her treatment inside prison under constant scrutiny. But more than that, she had become a symbol, some would say unwillingly, of a system that appeared not only unforgiving, but increasingly politicized. Public opinion had moved beyond sympathy. It had curdled into suspicion. People were no longer just asking, was the sentence too harsh? They were now demanding, who allowed this to happen and why? And that pressure was reaching a boiling point. In Westminster, opposition MPs, long afraid to challenge Starr's hardline stance publicly, began breaking ranks. A group of 5 Labour backbenchers wrote a joint letter to the Shadow Justice Secretary, demanding a review of sentencing laws for speech-related offences. They cited Lucy's disproportionate sentence and disturbing custody conditions as evidence of urgent systemic failure. The letter, though cautiously worded, was a direct challenge to Starr's authority, a signal that his grip on party unity was weakening. Inside the Labour leadership circle, concerns deepened. Senior strategists warned that the party was losing control of the narrative. Starmer's refusal to acknowledge the humanitarian angle of Lucy's case had created a vacuum, one that Tice was filling masterfully. Polling data revealed a sharp dip in Starr's approval rating among key demographics, especially working-class voters and civil liberties advocates. In contrast, Reform UK was surging. Though still a smaller party, their message was cutting through. Britain was broken and the old parties were blind to it. Meanwhile, Richard Tice's campaign gained momentum with staggering speed. His calls for Lucy's immediate release were now accompanied by a broader movement: justice for the silenced. What began as a protest against a prison sentence had transformed into a sweeping crusade against what Tice called the creeping authoritarianism infecting Britain's institutions. He framed Lucy not as an isolated victim, but as the first high-profile casualty of a much larger battle, the war against opinion, against open debate, and against a fearful elite desperate to control the public conversation. To strengthen this narrative, Tice introduced new evidence in a fiery parliamentary press conference. He presented testimony from multiple ex-prison staffers who alleged that Lucy was flagged as media-sensitive, and therefore subjected to stricter surveillance, reduced privileges, and psychological pressure. One former officer claimed she had been warned not to engage Lucy unless necessary, and to record any remarks that could be construed as political. Another described an unspoken directive from senior administrators: "Don't let her become a martyr." The press conference sent shock waves through the media. Even previously skeptical outlets began reporting on the emerging pattern of state overreach. Editorials called for a national review of hate speech enforcement. Civil Rights Watch DDogs demanded that the Ministry of Justice account for the alleged internal directives. And while Downing Street refused to comment, Starr's team once again released a short clinical statement reaffirming Labour's full confidence in the UK judicial process. But confidence was fading everywhere, except among those too entrenched to admit it. The public saw two leaders, one who was present, passionate, and speaking directly to their fears. The other aloof, cautious, and repeating lines that now sounded increasingly hollow. Tice toured the country, visiting towns neglected by the mainstream political machine, drawing crowds of people who had never attended a rally before, but now felt personally implicated in the Connelly case. "I'm here because I'm scared," one mother told reporters in Sheffield. "Not scared of a tweet, scared of saying the wrong thing and losing everything." And it was precisely that fear, the idea that the government had become too quick to punish speech, too slow to show mercy, that Richard Tice continued to weaponize against Starmer. During a nationally televised debate, Tice issued a direct challenge to the Labour leader. "Come with me to the prison, look Lucy Connelly in the eye, then tell the British people, this is justice." Starmer refused. The audience reaction was instant and brutal. Journalists and commentators began acknowledging what had previously been whispered only behind the scenes. Keir Starmer had miscalculated by refusing to engage emotionally by retreating into legally and bureaucratic talking points. He had not protected the judiciary. He had alienated the public. Even moderate voices began urging a course correction. "There is no shame in compassion," wrote one centre-left columnist. "There is danger in indifference." As the backlash grew, Starmer convened a closed-door meeting with senior advisers to reassess the political fallout. Leaked details from the meeting revealed a divided camp. Some aides argued that doubling down was the only path, that any sign of sympathy toward Lucy would be spun as endorsing hate. Others urged a more human approach, suggesting Starmer proposed a cross-party review of hate speech sentencing laws as a gesture of balance. Starmer reportedly listened but made no commitments. He remained as he had always been, cautious, measured, and unflinchingly focused on process over optics. But Britain was no longer in the mood for caution. With Lucy's law now gaining cross-party interest, Richard Tice escalated his campaign yet again. He announced plans to introduce a citizen-led panel that would gather testimony from others who claim to have been unfairly targeted under hate speech legislation. Within days, dozens came forward. A retired teacher questioned by police for a Facebook comment. A teenage girl suspended from school for a political meme. A care worker disciplined for sharing an article deemed harmful. Their stories painted a chilling picture not of isolated enforcement, but of a state apparatus increasingly responsive to outrage rather than reason. All of this placed a star in a shrinking political box. Every new voice, every leaked memo, every grassroots testimonial widened the chasm between his position and the people's mood. Yet, even as Reform UK's momentum built to a roar, Starmer continued to insist that nothing had gone wrong, that Britain was not in crisis, and that the system was functioning as intended. If you believe what happened to Lucy Connelly raises serious questions about freedom, fairness, and the future of justice in Britain, then don't stay silent. Share this video with your friends, your family, and anyone who cares about the truth. Let them see what the mainstream won't show. Subscribe to this channel for more unfiltered political updates and in-depth breakdowns that cut through the noise. And leave a comment below. Do you think Lucy's sentence was fair, or has Britain crossed a dangerous line? Your voice matters now more than ever.